Hey, what's up, y'all? This is Iskosi Fun Day back at it once again, kicking this for you and for yours. And this one right here is a New York Times article, about James Monroe, the President of the United States, probably the third, James Monroe enslaved hundreds of their descendants, Their descendants still live next door. A small African-American community existed less than 10 miles from the president's former plantation for generations. Only recently had the full extent of their relationship have been revealed. Now, this is done July 7, 2019, so this is fairly recent. Charlottesville, Virginia. So many Monroes in rural Albemarle County remember the moment they asked their parent or grandparent if they were somehow connected to the nation's fifth president, James Monroe. I stand corrected, the fifth. The Intel entrance to Monroe Plantation Estate, now a museum, having a fixture of their childhoods. Part of the landscape on a route back and forth to Charlottesville and to the small, predominantly African-American community called Monroe Town. Ida Monroe Sailor, 79, was riding in her father's green Chevrolet on the way to the grocery store in the early 1950s when he confirmed her suspicions. Monroe Jr., a cousin of Mrs. Taylor, spent most of his childhood at the homestead built by his great-great-grandfather, Edward Monroe, known as Ned, who parents believed to be enslaved by the president and one of the first known to carry his name. For slaves whose African heritage had long been stolen or lost, this was not uncommon. Mr. Monroe, 45, was about 8 years old when he posed a question to his father after driving by the plantation known as Highland. I haven't seen an interest sign my whole life, Mr. Monroe said. We were riding, and I asked my dad if we were the same Monroes. He would say yes, but he wouldn't say much more. We didn't talk about it. It was just understood that we were connected to the president not by blood, but by slavery. For 7 generations, members of the Monroe Town descendant community have lived less than 10 miles away from Highland. Yet until 3 years ago, there had never been a conversation between them and a museum. Now they are working together to change the way slavery is presented at the former national presidential plantation. The president lived at Highland from 1799 to 1823. The property which he purchased in 1793 was his family home, which he served as governor of Virginia and president. It is now owned by his alma mater, William and Mary. As president, Monroe was supporter of abolition, but he enslaved up to 250 people in his lifetime. Daily tours of Highland website note the contradiction. Visitors are now told by the nearby descendant community. They are also told by 2 enslaved men by name, Peter Morley and George, who built the Monroe guest house. A space under the porch of the guest house is refashioned to reflect the former use as slave quarters. Biographies of the enslaved will soon be presented, and William and Mary began recording the oral histories of the descendants. A more layered and competitive narrative about the lives of men, women, and children enslaved by Monroe was built upon one family guest's quest to trace his roots, and discovery made by 2 independent researchers in the museum designed to accurately reflect the role of slavery played on the plantation of a founding father. The intersection of those related paths unfolding as a part of a larger cultural reckoning is an American story. When George Monroe Jr. eventually made his way to Highland in 2016, he was searching for clues of who I come from and what makes me me. Entering the visitor center, he wanted to know more about his family. Highland wanted to know more about him. We are all Monroes. Highland rises against the southwest mountains. There it once stood a 3,500 acre estate filled with grain crops. It is now a tourist attraction, about 2 miles from Thomas Jefferson's Monticello. After emancipation, some of the enslaved carried the Monroe name and settled nearby, and formally calling their free community Monroe Town. This is where the Monroe descendants' first chapter begins. The family estimated there are fewer than 100 Monroes still live in that area. On a Sunday afternoon of 2017, Martin Violet, a part-time researcher and guide at Highland, went to Meadow Oak Baptist, a teeny white church in Monroe Town. Mr. Violet and Miranda Burnett, also a Highland guide, set out to find out what happened to the enslaved men and women and children sold by Monroe on a Florida plantation owner nearly 200 years ago. It was Mr. Violet and found instead that the entire community of Monroe descendants right on Highland's doorstep. In the parking lot of Middle Oak Baptist after the service, Mr. Violet approached a group of African American women, all in their 70s, members who had worshiped at church since they were children. He inquired about the Monroes. "You have come to the right place," one of the women exclaimed. "We are all Monroes." It turned out that more than half of the church members were a large part of the Monroe family, tracing back to Highland. Up to that point, we had no idea of this community right here, said Sarah Bond Harper, Highland's executive director. It had been a big thing for our institution like ours to forge the relationship absolutely from scratch, and we had a responsibility to get it right. But the question is, what is right, she added. Having a connection with the descendant community is a spark for us to tell a more inclusive and authentic history. By the time Mr. Violet found his way in the Middle Oak, following the clues left behind by Monroe records, Monroe had already visited Highland, and he and his cousin Francis Scott, the family historian, were already chasing their history back to the plantation and learning more about the connections between the president and their community. But no formal conversation had been initiated with the museum. We are talking about the pains of slavery and the ties that bind us at the start of our story in America, said Jennifer Sales Stacy, 56, Mrs. Sales' daughter and lifelong member of Middle Oak. We want to know more about our ancestors who helped give them back a sense of humanity. A small group of Monroe descendants gathered at Highland in March 2018 to begin on several discussions on how best to incorporate its family history. The meetings had also become a space to talk about the legacy of slavery, racial inequities, and reparation, now part of the national dialogue. It's hard to put in a word what it feels like to grow up this close to the plantation where your roots are, Mrs. Sawyer said. Once I knew we came from there, and I often wondered what became of our people. Separated by centuries and hundreds of miles. Last year, Brent Leggs, an executive director of the African American Cultural Heritage Action Fund, an initiative pushed by the National Trust of Historic Preservation, and a group of historians, preservationists, descendants, and site directors gathered at the first National Summit on Teaching Slavery at James Madison, Montpelier, to talk about the engaging descendant communities. Both George Monroe and Mrs. Bonner Harper attended. The same year, Monticello opened its first exhibits of the living quarters of Sally Hemings. The Sally Hemings is Thomas Jefferson's slave that he used to have sex with. You know what I'm saying? Most of the narrative about the black experience is about a painful past, but we have an opportunity today to uncover hidden stories of activism, resistance, and black agency rooted in slavery, Mr. Leggs said. This is about the typical expanded beyond the typical stories of brutality and justice to the stories of black life and black love, and how our community overcame the most difficult chapter in American history. At Monroe, visitors learned about Monroe's vision for a federal government and its opposition to European colonialism in the Americas, known as the Monroe Doctrine. In 1828, Monroe sold up to 2,000 enslaved people for $5,000 to Joseph Mill White, the owner of Casablanca, a cane and cotton plantation just outside Monticello, Florida, to pay out his mounting debt after his presidency. Mrs. Violet, a ninth-generation Virginian, and Mrs. Burnett, a reference librarian, shared their research of the sale of by the basic question: how many enslaved were sold? Did they leave Florida after emancipation? Then, after visiting Middle Oak, they wondered, how could they be related by blood to the Monroe descendants in Virginia? The research portal of archival records documenting shippings, manifesting, property inventory, bills of sales, death certificates. In a letter to James Madison, Monroe said he had arranged to have the enslaved taken in families, at least 3 couples, Deli and Eve, Toby and Betsy, Jim and Calypso, along with their children, was sent to Florida, yanking apart a larger Highland enslaved community. The more we were able to find, the more we knew how important it was to try to help reunite these two communities, Violet said. 15 months after Violet visited Middle Oak, he and Mr. Burnett visited another small church, this time in Florida. It was founded in part by children once enslaved at Highland. The researchers met about a dozen people in Monticello including a woman whose grandfather was a descendant of Dudley and Eve, one of the enslaved couples in Florida, to the first direct link between the two descendant communities in Florida and Virginia. Mrs. Barnett cried as she described piercing together the life of Garnett Sanders, a son of Toby and Bessie, who was about 18 when he was sold with his parents and sent to Casa Bianca. After emancipation, he appeared in the 1870 census with his occupation listed as a blacksmith. He was registered to vote in 1867 and cast a ballot in the 1876 presidential race. It means he made it. He made it to freedom, Mrs. Barnett said. It's incredible discovery to find evidence that an enslaved person was finally able to live free. Mrs. Barnett and Viola hoped to identify more Highland descendants in both states. And this August, the two communities connected by slavery, but separated by centuries and hundreds of miles, could be brought together for the first time. Once Mrs. Barnett and Miss Viola shared that they had learned in Florida with those of Virginia. Walter Eubanks, a Monroe descendant of Virginia, suggested inviting the Florida descendants to attend the annual Monroe homecoming celebration in Virginia next month. I want the treasure hunt to go on so we can find even more connection between these two communities, Mrs. Eubanks said. We have the same root and we might have the same bloodline. We might be cousins. And there you have it, So there's two communities of the first president, James Monroe, one in Florida and one in Virginia, where he sold slaves off, and doing his thing. And also the slave population in Virginia that he had never really moved far from the plantation, and they stayed where they was at. But that's just a little good piece of history to know about, about Monroe and his slaves. What happened to him. This is Iskosi of Fun Day. Hey, show love, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel. And plus also donate to the movement. Hit the, the Cash App Iskosi, donate to the movement. I'll be back at y'all again with some more Black History. Peace.